How can we consider the Roman Empire? As a recent collective volume suggests, may we reconsider Roman power? And in the perspective of this lecture series, what was supposed to be a Roman Empire, its powers and the conception of the empire its res gestae can deliver? I would like to stress a few elements to present an overview dealing with ancient evidence and modern approaches, from the traditional construction proposed during the second part of the 19th century by Mommsen, for example, to more recent reflection about an imperial res publica, for which each princeps, bone or mali principes, so to speak, like the Historia Augusta, could put on a special persona. Literary testimonies, inscriptions, coins, portraits, and monuments tell us a story about the first historical globalization from various perspectives: the functioning of an imperial res publica with an emperor as a head, usually considered as a sovereign, and an imperial territory made of provinces and conquered nations, a body politic composed by people who were, after AD 212, citizens thanks to the universal grant of the Civitas Romana by the Constitutio Antoniniana. Let me begin with a few remarks about methodological and epistemological aspects of the reflection I want to develop today. To speak about emperors, imperial power, and empire, we must consider first the words in the specific Roman context in Latin. It's quite easy to speak of imperatores, caesares, Augusti, or principes, even if it's necessary to be aware of the great importance of naming the statue principis and the man in charge of the Imperium Romanum. We'll see below how our epigraphical evidence could deliver a real message to inform everybody, Roman and local citizens, of the specific identity of their emperor. Then, what about an imperial power, or specifically in Latin, an imperium imperii Romani? We would have in mind that in Latin, the conception of an imperial power was quite impossible. The Imperium Romanum appeared with the first great conquest made by this little city of Latium and the transformation of those territories in provinces. Imperium first, a legal notion, Imperium Domi, then the concrete result of a certain expression of this power outside the city, Imperium Militiae, and finally, the modern reception of the context of an Imperium Romanum sine fine, especially in front of modern, colonial, and post-colonial empires, and debates about modern meanings of classical Greek constitution, the famous Aristotelian politeiai. During this lecture, a few examples from Augustus to Constantine or Julian should demonstrate the flexibility and pragmatism of the Augustan model of principate and its various declinations. Not a true republic, neither a monarchy or colonial empire, but very special city-state, res publica, becoming an empire state, assuming traditions and res novae under the protection of gods. First, the discord delivered by the res gestae, Divi Augusti, an imperial biography, and an Augustan narrative. It's necessary to discuss the true nature of this epigraphic text in our present perspective. What uniqueness and status it had, and so the real meaning and place we can give to it for an history of the principate aborigine, and so for many reflections about auto and biography and imperial history. I would like to underline those specific dimensions of this inscription for my purpose. The first one is the meaning of its political balancing act, when viewed in the light at once of the first emperor's first attempt a true autobiography, abandoned sometimes after 22 BC, and also of the double laudatio funebris pronounced by Tiberius, the new princeps from the rostra of Caesar's temple, as well as by Drusus, his son and consul designated in AD 14 from the Julian rostra during the official ceremony of Augustus' funeral. The other is the sketch of the program for the diffusion of the res gestae, for which we have been able to compare what we learn from the regulations we find very few years after in the Senatus Consultum Decnao Pisone Patri, with the list of honors decided for Germanicus about the policy of a public posting up of the Senatus Consultum in every city and camp of the empire. But we need first to have in mind the process of enunciation of the text and then of its diffusion. If Augustus himself wrote this summary of his principal deeds from 22 to 2 BC, the last chapter of the res gestae commemorates the reception of the title Pater Patriae in 2 BC, when the Forum Augustum has been inaugurated. The last corrections were introduced in AD 14, perhaps after the princeps' death by Tiberius. The preamble of the copy from Ancira names the emperor as Deus Augustus, and is supposed to have been written for its precise purpose, to be displayed on the walls of the Temple of Rome and Augustus of the Colonia. I quote the translation by Coulet. Below is a copy of the achievements of the deified Augustus, by which he made the world subject to the rule of the Roman people, the Imperium Populi Romani, and of the expenses which he incurred for the state and the people of Rome, Res Publica and Populus Romanus, as inscribed upon 2 bronze columns which has been set up at Rome. But in Rome, on the Campus Martius, in the vast Augustan complex with the Mausoleum, where the res gestae were displayed, on those 2 pillars, bronze tables, the Arapacis, the funerary pyre, and the Orologium, we can guess that the identity of the emperor was, in that context, a human one. So, laudationes funebras and res gestae should be understood during this first period of succession and accession to the empire as a Tiberian staging of his father's deeds according to the precise mandata received. This text delivered 2 messages. Firstly, the Augustan version of the Roman history, from the Trillium Period to the dedication of Forum Augustum, and especially in respect of the so-called Res Publica Restituta. In fact, the Augustan methodical and pragmatic appropriation of the Republic. And secondly, an account of the institution of a principate and, above all, the powers of the Imperator Caesar Augustus. Names, titles, functions. In fact, in the many epigraphic imperial titulations since Augustus, the imperium is regularly mentioned as the praemomen, imperator, then by the various consulships, and the acclamation as imperator, and finally with the several emperors in the conclusive mention as proconsul, because consulship and proconsulship are linked to the imperium. But we must understand the meaning of this Roman monument on the field of Mars and of its copies displayed in the provinces. We have an official account of Augustus' deeds, prepared and decided in Rome by the princeps and his adoptive son. But to assess it in its Roman context, we are limited to literary evidence about the Roman events of Augustus in September AD 14, and epigraphic testimonies from Anatolia. Of course, remains the vast problem raised by many scholars about the legibility of those monumental inscriptions and consequently the real implication of it. I suggest that the most important political ritual was the senatorial meeting, during which Tiberius and then Drusus read the whole text in front of senators who had been, for the elders, witnesses to and actors in the political drama during more than half a century of autobiography has been replaced by a true history in acts, delivered as a communal memory to the senators, and during the funerals and through the monumental staging in Rome and elsewhere to the populus Romanus and the populations of the empire. Performing this real act of pietas was a political necessity for Tiberius in the summer of AD 14, and it delivers a few lessons. A crucial one is the personalization of the accounts of the register of political and diplomatic decisions. As is well known, only very few names are mentioned in the text, except the regular presence of Augustus' sons, Caius and Lucius, and of the kings of Armenia and Parthia. The personal relationships between the late Roman emperor and foreign kings are clearly expressed through embassies, adme, arme, and by the regular mentions of amicitia. This will be a permanent structure within Roman imperial history, from the beginnings of the Imperium Romanum with the republican magistrates to late antiquity. From a true autobiography to this personal ame narrative of an history made of deeds, the main conception remains a de vita sua, or some commentary written by an emperor or his closest relatives or friends, may build a political discourse, which can be interpreted by contemporaries as a collective memory. The Anatolian monuments, in strong connection with the incipient imperial cult, were essentially testimonials to a new imperial regime made of Augustan words and deeds. They contributed to the permanent commemoration of Roman space and Roman time all over the empire, Roman monuments, Roman festi, Roman festivals. It could be used during ceremonies that amounted to true political rituals with processions, acts of worship, discourses. This extensive monumental Augustan discourse was not supposed to be read by anyone, even in Rome, but has to be understood as a piece of evidence of a Roman collective identity, what I would like to present as an imperial discourse. In that perspective, we may assume that the senatorial meeting during which 4 rolls were presented and read, the will, the index rerum asse gestarum, the mandata de funere, and the breviarum totius imperii, unfold as a performative action. The designated successor was engaged by his father's deeds, and an official story was delivered in front of senators, especially in the first chapter with the Augustan interpretation of the civil wars, the Trillium Period from 43 to 30 BC. This true imperial ceremony was organized in the center of the Res Publica in the Julian Curia by 2 men, Tiberius and his son Drusus, in charge of a perennial Augustan state. The noble status and the control of an established dynasty. But the heading of the Ancira monument delivered a wider message for the provinces of a bilingual empire that was subdued by the emperor to the Imperium Populi Romani. We find at the beginning of the Principate a testimony urbi et orbi of the essential clues to understand what was the Augustan regime. the staging in space and time of the supposed consensus universorum. We can analyze the text with those perspectives in mind: the orbis terrarum, Rome, the Italy and the provinces, the world beyond the frontiers, the places in Rome and their political dimensions within a res publica in action, the Senate, the populus, the equites Romani, and so on. This is the assertion of a man and his authority, his powers over and from the Republic, and with an affirmative action about legal forms, collegiality, annual periodicity, legalism of the institutional processes, a discourse about an identity which finally asserts the imperial legitimacy of the imperator, Caesar Augustus. Second, an autobiography and biography towards an imperial history. If we consider first Roman Emperor Augustus, whom I have chosen as a permanent reference during this lecture, we can study his life and principate thanks to an amount of evidence, epigraphical or numismatic, as well as literary, with biographies, a lost autobiography, and a few personal writings, which has been studied by many generations of Roman historians from antiquity to our modern world. The conception of a genre, the so-called autobiography, was at the origin of various researches undertaken by classicists to examine either a literary model or an historical source. It's essential for our perspective to answer a few questions about the real meaning of a pro domo sua literary production by certain principes, but not so many: Augustus, Tiberius, Claudius, Vespasian, Trajan, Hadrian, and Septimius Severus. If we try to understand the perception of the alleged nous status from Augustus to several times, and the various strategies engaged by emperors under certain circumstances to celebrate their own deeds. For my purpose, three observations deserve special emphasis. First, concerning the project which has been interpreted as an apologia for the first 20 years of Augustus' political career, from his debut in 44-43 BC, exactly the context of the first paragraph of the future Resgestyle, to the victorious Spanish campaign in 25 BC. Second, to explain the correlative fact that the project was abandoned at what time and not a few years later. And third, the conception of new project, the Resgestyle, which could be considered as a central piece of what I would like to define as an imperial discourse. In fact, those three questions are mainly connected to the process of a pragmatic reconstruction of the so-called Res Publica Restituta, which was supposed to win the consensus universorum. I would argue that the possible use, but of course with correction, of Augustus' autobiography by Cassius Dio may underlie the general conception of the three books, 51, 52, and 53 of his history, with the peculiar attention which it gives to the part played by the amici principes Agrippa and Maecenas, masterfully integrated in the process of the transformation of the Republican state by the staging of a political debate, monarchy versus democracy. But what could be said afterwards by the senator at the beginning of the 3rd century AD would have been uneasy during the 20th BC in a context during which the consensus remained shaky. If we understand this, I quote Tim Cornell, Roman habit of autobiographical writing in terms of personal achievement as a marker of status and prestige, publicly celebrated and commemorated for the benefit of prosperity, We must think about the evolution of the regime and the necessity for the princeps to assume a destiny which surpasses other competitors' personal achievements. The Reichstag would be the perfect medium to encompass the traditional processes for commemorating the nobilis in the city of Rome and give them a new and authoritative status, as I've tried to demonstrate in the past through the various festivals and ceremonies used and transformed in order to identify the prince and the city. Third, an imperial discourse in Rome, from Rome, to Rome. The impact of an imperial discourse in the urban space was essentially, in an imperial city like Rome and the many other provincial cities during the first 4 centuries of the empire, a combination of monumental display, epigraphical developments of texts, and the staging of ceremonies that deliver through acts of worship, processions, pieces of eloquence by rhetors, and elaborated message. But it's difficult to decide between an amount of evidence which texts participate truly to an imperial discourse and what was the real official aspect of the process of celebration of the imperial power. Maybe we must assume a double process by official celebration and elaboration on the one hand, and personal choices made by members of provincial and imperial elites in their own epigraphical habit on the other hand, that could have shared the same object and approach of what was a Roman emperor, so to speak, like Paul Venn, and what we could understand as a multiple process of communication through the imperial and urban spaces. Let me add 2 examples. Firstly, from Palestine, we can have a look at a millstone dedication of Julian with the last reading proposed by Werner Heck. The practice of millstone dedication using the dative case could be understood in the context of the imperial journeys to be erected during the visits of emperors and to address their message, to welcome the principes and to commemorate their virtues. They can be considered as pieces of evidence of a staging of the emperor's powers, imperial, and with the development of introductive formulas of the commemoration of their statute, the protection of the empire, Romani Orbis Liberatori, against its enemies, the so-called barbarians, Barbarorum Extinctori, the protection of an urban civilization, the Curiae and the Res Publica, Curiarum et Rei Publicae Recreatori, and its gods in the specific context of the pagan reign of Julian, Temporum Restauratori. Secondly, we can consider the base from the Forum Romanum that has been erased after the victory of Constantine against Maxentius. It was a commemoration of the god Mars and his son Romulus and Remus, the condidores of the Roman troops. We should notice the reference to the perennial city that has been in fact completely appropriated by the princeps. Aeternae urbi suae, as I've tried to demonstrate in the past through the urban ceremonies. In the center of Rome, the Imperial Forum Romanum was definitely the place of the celebration of the history of the city from its origins, and with this dedication on the 21st of April, Natalis Orbis and then Romaya. Maxentius was the true successor of the different conditores of Rome and the last Roman emperor, father of the deceased Romulus, conservator Orbisuae with the last coherent program of buildings. The Constantinian Rome was the heir of Maxentius' project, but with the beginning of a Christian building program of churches. Another world, but in the same conceptual perspective of a city full of imperial memories, inwards, and stones. We will consider Rome as an example in a true imperial perspective. The urban discourse about the origin of the city of Rome is essential if one is to find some positive evidence to interpret the archaeological surveys of Roman colonies and municipia. The self-identification of Roman cities as Little Rome everywhere in the Imperium Romanum, considered as vast territory under the Roman power, combining various identities. It was known that Augustus was almost granted the cognomen Romulus by senators during the assemblies in January 27 BC, and finally preferred the far less provocative Augustus. He paid particular attention to his persona as a new condita, founder of Rome and the Roman world. In this respect, it's useful to quote Livy's introduction, Praefectio 6, of his Ab Urbe Condita, which contains a set of imperial figures from the past, Romulus, and the present, Augustus, to emphasize what was not to be considered as imperialism. I quote, "Such traditions as belong to the time before the city was founded, or rather was presently to be founded, and are rather adorned with poetic legends than based upon trustworthy historical proofs. I propose neither to affirm nor to refute. It's the privilege of antiquity to mingle divine things with human, and so to add dignity to the beginnings of cities. And if any people ought to be allowed to consecrate their origins and refer them to a divine source, so great is the military glory of the Roman people that when they profess that their father and the father of the founder was none other than Mars, the nations of the earth may well submit to this also with as good as grace as they submit to Rome's dominion." End of the quote. Augustus' successors were equally concerned with the origins of Rome and with the idea of Rome's eternity. Commodus was represented on coins as a city founder, tracing the sulcus primigenus, primordial furrow, during the limitation ritual carried out by a carriage with 2 oxen. The festival of the foundation of Rome, the rustic Parilia or Palilia, a celebration of the earth, which was named after Pallas, the goddess of the shepherds, and fell on the 21st of April, Natalis Urbis, was renamed Romaya during Adrian's Principate in fervent commemoration of the city. Similarly, the Jubilees, the Pseudo-Ludis Saecularis under Claudius in 47 for the 800th birthday of Rome, those under Antonius Pius in 148 for her 900th birthday, and those under Philip the Arab in 248 for her millennium birthday, were as important as the traditional secular games, which were renewed by Augustus in 17 BC and were subsequently celebrated by Domitian in 88 and by Septimius Severus and Caracalla in 204. The Imperial Discourse considers the conception of a territorial empire, like the Statio Principis, as a double mirror, which can be appropriated into a rhetoric construction about good and bad emperors, in the perspective of such a construction of a collective and personal identity created from res gestae and personae. Imperial titilatures can be analyzed as a way to define the Imperium Romanum as a space, a process of transformation of territories by the Roman army or after diplomatic agreements, and has a means to think about a universal city embodied by its princeps. The cognomina de victarum gentium, whose name of nations conquered, can be understood as a perception of what was considered becoming Roman in the perspective of military campaigns and the ensuing process of provincialization. We can illustrate the process through the example of Septimius Severus and Julian's cognomina, Arabicus, Adiabenicus, et Particus Maximus, for the first, Alamannicus Maximus, Franciscus Maximus, and Sarmaticus Maximus for the old. The permanence of the imperial identity as expressed through references to the power of the princeps and the ways in which he was commemorated becomes clear, from example, at the very end of our period of study during the 4th and the 5th century AD. Constantine was celebrated as the Maximus Victor after he had abandoned the title in Victus ac triumphator semper Augustus. He was, as far as we trust the evidence, the first emperor with 9 cognomina, a naturally protector of the empire and its inhabitants. To conclude, I would like to underline 2 methodological remarks about the study of this process of gradual construction of an imperial discourse. Firstly, we may be aware of the precise status of our documents, their more or less private or official nature, their supposed public aspect, which was not the proof of any normative forced expression. It means the wide problem of the imperial titulature, its precise definition, the numerous documents we use to connect in series, but which are of different statuses, mostly non-official. Secondly, the evolution of the naming of emperors from the 1st to the 5th century AD with major transformations. Personal name and official tria nomina, Imperator, Caesar Augustus, introductive formulas, Domini Nostri, our masters, from the first assessment by the Flavians of a sequence, after a century of patrimonial practices by Augustus, and the Julio-Claudians, combining 2 identities in order to deliver the first official reality to the Statio Principis, and various uses during the 3rd and the 4th century, from the Severi to the Tetrarchy. It's relevant to finish this lecture by underlying the proper signification of those imperial names, the so-called titulature, a true connection between a man, his power, and the conception of an empire. And so I thank you very much.